I was born in San Francisco, but at age 2, along with my 2 older siblings, who were 5 and 8, we were sent to Japan for our Japanese education and stayed there until 1931 at age 7. I didn't speak a word of English. My parents lived in a purely Caucasian area because they were working for different Caucasian families, domestic help, cook and cleaning houses. And they lived in the Pacific Heights of San Francisco. And naturally, I went to the local grammar school. And a good grammar school, one of the best in San Francisco, because of high income neighborhood. And then that's where I spent from age appropriate grade with not speaking any English until I graduated grammar school. They did a beautiful job of teaching me English, where I spoke no English. And so I really am very thankful for those teachers who giving me English lesson, or along with curriculum. I graduated Grant Elementary School with 8th grade at that time, and I was accepted into Lowell High School. I lived in the Pacific Heights where all my schoolmates lived. I used to go in a chauffeured limousine to Lowell High School, the chauffeured car of the Saddleback Crown Paper Company. The grandmother used to send her limousine for my friend Al to be chauffeured to school. And I was told to meet the chauffeured limousine 2 blocks away from my house, and the chauffeur would not come to my house. Anyway, here I am living in that neighborhood. And then my father is naturally working in the neighborhood, cleaning houses. And one of the things that he asked me to do was scrub the front steps. This step is only a half a block away from where I go to school in a chauffeured limousine with Al, my friend. And so my strategy was, well, very likely Al would not be up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I went with my bucket and a broom, carrying it in my shoulder, for about 4 blocks from my house, and cleaned those steps for 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. After the war, I wanted to continue my education. And so I filled the application for City College of San Francisco. And where did you graduate? Lowell High School. The issue of did you graduate with a diploma never came up because I was evacuated in April and my graduation was June. And I just happened to live in this exclusion order 41 district. And so this applied to all portions of the City College of San Francisco, Presidio Avenue, Sutter Street, Van Ness Avenue. There were no exclusion orders by individual. All ethnic Japanese had to go. And this was the day that I was evacuated from San Francisco. I think this was taken by Margaret Burke White. She happened to be there to photograph us, the first group of Japanese forced out of San Francisco. And she happened to focus on this boy, and my brother and I happened to be in the background. At Santa Anita Racetrack, we were placed in a horse stall, where 6 months earlier they held 2 horses. Now there was 4 of us. We stayed in the horse stall for essentially 6 months from April to November. And my parents stayed in the inner hostel, and my brother and I stayed on the outer with two army carts. Getting in line for meals was a major part of the day. 3 meals a day where you had to get in line. You tended to stay as much as possible at the beginning of the line because food would run out by the end of the line. And the kitchen crew had to improvise. And improvisation was usually Frenchman. I hate the damn thing because usually that was what the tail end got. Because that was easy to make at the last minute. When we entered camp, we were interviewed for activities. What can you do? And I said, well, I was getting ready to go to Stanford. What did your parents do? They cleaned with domestic house cleaners in the Pacific Heights. Non-saleable items in the concentration camp. And so the question came, well, what did you do after school? I went and read the 4 San Francisco newspapers, the Call Bulletin, the News Chronicle, Examiner. And where did you read? In the fire station. I said, that's right. I knew what a coupling was. I knew what a male and the female end of a hose was. So like this, you are a fireman. So I was a fireman at Topaz. Tule Lake, same kinds of question. What did you do? I was a fireman at Topaz. You are now a captain of a fire department. Good thing I never went to a fire the time I was on duty. My first government paycheck I ever got. Full amount of $1.70. And this is a work permit for working at the Tule Lake. This was a Hawaiian orchestra. A group of us were playing, and here I am playing the guitar. This is in Tule Lake. All young men, lots of time, nothing to do. I turned 18 the first week at San Anita racetrack, living in a horse stable. Everybody who turned 18 had to sign up for selective service, which I did, expecting to be 1A because I was physically fit, a member of a crew team at Lowell High School and all. And then I got a classification which almost all Nisei had no idea what it was, classification 4C, which was enemy alien. I went into camp as a Japanese, ethnic Japanese, and all ethnic Japanese were enemy aliens. That was the basis for putting all ethnic Japanese into camps, the concentration camps. December 7, 1941, Japan attacked United States at Pearl Harbor. In January of 1942, I had 2 citizenship, one United States by natural birth, and the Japanese citizenship because my father registered my birth with the Japanese consulate. So December 7th, I'm caught in a bind by 2 countries who are at war with each other. So in January of 42, my brother and I decided to give up our Japanese citizenship. This is acceptance of my renunciation of my Japanese citizenship. And this is acceptance from the Japanese government. And although I renounced it in January of 1942, this is dated 1956, after the war. I am officially non-Japanese with these 2 documents. When I signed up for selective service, they called me an enemy alien. So that plus this made me feel that this country was not my country. So I renounced my American citizenship. Notice of approval of renunciation, and this is the acceptance of my renunciation. And so here is my alien registration card. And so I renounced both Japanese and American citizenship, and for a while I was a stateless person. All people 17 and over had to register with the government, and everybody had to sign this document which said application for leave clearance. That in itself was very confusing because the most difficult question was question 2728, which is here. Number one, would you go into the army if army wants you? Well, I went into selective service. They gave me a 4C. I had renounced my U.S. citizenship. So with that question, would you go into the military, and then would you forswear any and all allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? Well, wait a minute. The question is, did I ever swear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan at any point? If so, I had renounced my Japanese citizenship. So with that, I answered accordingly, no, no. And then once you declared no, no, there were certain consequences. Approximately 17,000 people in the 10 different camps signed no, no, or some part of no, no. And they were all sent to Tule Lake. Any Japanese born in the United States who has spent more than 5 years in Japan became under another category. From age 2 to age 7 for 5 years, I became under that category of suspicious people. One day, the military was asked to go to one side of the camp, and the Caucasian staff on the other side of the camp. And then they, in a line, they squeezed us gradually. And if your name was on that list, you were picked up and sent to another area. Then in time, each member from the group was taken out of the group. And we didn't know what was happening to that individual. Then in time, it was my turn. So in this regularly lit room, I was taken into a very bright room, and told to wait. And then 2 burly guards grabbed me on both sides and took me into a black room where I could not see anything, and they sat me down in a chair. And then they let me go, and all I could see was absolutely nothing, going from a brightly lit room to a black room. And then I remember a voice shooting me from the dark, and then I have a complete blank in my life from that point, coming to, so to say, sitting on a cot in the barrack, reserved for those of us who were troublemakers. So that was the beginning of my experience at the stockade. In Tule Lake, 1943, all people who were suspicious were, so to say, picked up by the military and then placed in the stockade. Some of the people knew very well why they were there. They were heads of organizations and such. There were others like me who had no idea why we were there. We were there for 3 months, going through various incidents. I remember one incident, the ground was covered with snow, and we were told to get up and get outside, just as we were. And so we grabbed a jacket if we did, others didn't bother to grab. And so we had to stand outside. Some of us didn't have anything on our feet, standing out there in the snow-covered, and they surrounded us with guns. And then by the entry to the stockade, they had backed up a truck. And on the back of the truck, they had a machine gun pointed at us. And we just stood there. And had no idea what. Then finally, for no reason, we were dismissed. After standing, I remember from during the daytime to dusk. There was another time, after being in the stockade for a number of weeks, there was discussion, well, we ought to find out why we are here. And so we asked the guard, the colonel who was in charge, we would like to know why we are here. He had no response. You're here because I said so, response. And then we discussed it and decided, not the whole group, but the leaders of the stockade people decided that the whole stockade would go on a hunger strike. And we went on a hunger strike for 7 days. The medical staff will come in and ask us questions, and they would take the sick ones out, and we didn't know what was happening to them. The rumors were rampant, actually. Oh, they're going to shoot them, kill them, get rid of them. They're going to take them to the hospital. Or what they did was take them to the hospital because they were physically weak. And that went on for 7 days. And finally we said, well, I guess nothing's going to happen, we better eat. So on the 7th day we started eating. I went into camp April 7, 1942, until March of 1946. 6 months after Japan declared its surrender. For whatever reason, I was on this special list, and I had to get a special permission to be able to leave. By then, all the 9 other camps had been closed. I left Tule Lake mid-March. And with that, went to Chicago, on my way to New York. I just happened to have a friend in Chicago, and he told me to stick around with me, so I did that. And then we worked in a restaurant. And when you have no money, only $25, which the government gave me, and no place to go, $25 went toward the rent, and working in a restaurant, I had food. So there I became, from a dishwasher making salads to a short order cook within a couple of weeks. And then I left that job to work in a factory for a short while. And then I gave that up to go to New York for less than a week, and visit Washington, D.C. for a couple of days, and came back to San Francisco to start the fall semester at City College of San Francisco. So that was the chronological period. And now I'm back in San Francisco in City College, UC Berkeley. My father was probably the one leading authority on Japanese swords in the Bay Area. And he had quite a collection of swords. So I grew up with swords, to the point that when the evacuation came about and the Japanese Americans had to turn in all of the contraband material, which meant Brownie cameras, binoculars, Brownie camera, telescopes, and Japanese swords. Well, I helped Dad bring 106 Japanese swords to the police station at the 6th and Geary Street station. It's a very small police station next to the old French hospital. And that's where we brought out Dad's contraband material. And then 42, 46, 4 years later, 4.5 years later, I helped my father go claim this item. And he had a little claim check, a small claim check that big. And the policeman at the desk said, "Oh my God, that's 4 years ago, we know nothing about it." And I knew that was pretty much what to expect. However, an older policeman who had been more than 4 years there said, "Hey, wait a minute, fellas, there's a package here that we don't know anything about. Let's see what it is." But it was my father's contraband material, including his 106 Japanese swords. So my father was one of the very fortunate few that was able to claim what he was able to submit as contraband. Now, if we lived in Japantown, we would have brought it to the local police department, and they would have dumped it with all the ethnic Japanese contraband. Whereas ours was the only Japanese American family who was able to bring a contraband material. And they didn't know what to do with it, so they just left it there for 4 years. Our family did not lose anything. Additionally, the Japanese American families had to give up all of their household belongings. If they were farmers, they have to give up all farm equipment and farm, home, whatever. If they were town people, they gave up whatever they had in order to be able to carry into camp what they could carry. And we were also in a situation where we had to get ready to go into camp with what we could carry. Well, we had an 8-bedroom house where my father was a domestic help in the Pacific Heights home. So the owner of the home said, "Well, bring everything into our basement." And so we brought everything into the basement, including my 10-pound dumbbells, and which my son took over to Los Angeles. And we lost absolutely nothing. Kitchen, cooking equipment are all prior World War II materials that I have. So it's amazing what I have. It's all pre-World War II. And all the furnishing, bedroom, house, living room, bedroom, it was all until my brother gave up the house. I was a senior at UC Berkeley in the sociology major, and I happened to be 24 plus, turning 25. Once you turn 25, you were beyond selective service. But until 25, everybody was eligible, including me. And here I am, a graduating senior at Berkeley, and I felt this is kind of silly. This is peacetime for me to go into the military. So I tried to avoid that by joining the Army reserve, and they would not accept me. It's not only me, they would not accept anybody at that point because they knew that we were trying to avoid the draft. And so I tried to get into the Army Reserve, the Navy Reserve. Navy was not taking Japanese at that time. And of all things, the U.S. Marine Corps was accepting, so I became a member of the Marine Corps. So this is my selective service, which said, I am 4C enemy alien. I had renounced my U.S. citizenship, and they didn't know that, and they wanted me to join. So I volunteered for of all things, the U.S. Marine Corps. So here I am, Marine Corps, until 1 month before Korea, at which time my discharge is listed 30 days before Korea. And this is my company in the Marine Corps, and I'm pictured over here. And immediately after the war with North Korea was declared, this whole outfit was activated and went to Korea. And actually they were the first to Korea and first to come back. 50% did not come back. And I could have been in that 50% just as easily. I graduated with a sociology BA, went on to their doctoral program in sociology. And they would not let me do the type of studying I wanted to do, community work. So the only place they were doing any kind of community work was the School of Social Welfare. So I transferred to School of Social Welfare. In the first year program at UC, the PhD program, I was doing community volunteer work with various agencies, research in discrimination in the hospital settings in San Francisco. And this is what I wanted to continue with my PhD in sociology. But unfortunately, Berkeley's PhD did not allow for this kind of research. It was only library work. And the faculty said, Mr. Yamanaka, we just don't have any faculty to teach you, to be a faculty advisor for anything like this. I said, well, there's somebody in social work that could help me on this. And so with that, I switched over to social work. In those days, the dean of the graduate school would welcome each person coming into the program. They don't do this anymore, just too many of them. And his comment was, well, Mr. Yamanaka, welcome to social work. What would you like to do? And the cocky person that I was, I said, well, what do you got to offer me coming from sociology? Well, he was flustered. He said, well, we have casework and group work. Casework, what's that? I'm in a graduate school of social work, and I'm asking what's social casework. And his answer was essentially, we work one-to-one. And I said, well, what's social group work? We work one-to-group. Well, I think I would prefer social group work. So that's how I ended up being a social group worker. And as such, I did my first year of internship at the Mission Community Center, settlement house in the Mission District. And then I did the second year internship at the International Institute of San Francisco. And the director of International Institute asked me to join the faculty. And that's how I became a social worker at the International Institute, where I stayed for 6 years. I was an advisor to a young adult group. And the young adult group had an volunteer from the agency, and fine, we got along well together. That developed into a relationship to the point that I asked her to marry me, and then at that point, my family had a tradition of Sunday night dinner, where the family would all get together for Sunday night dinner. And then one Sunday night, I brought up the subject. I was going to marry a woman, and they said, who? And it's a Caucasian. Oh. And that was the end of the subject. Then the next Sunday I went to the dinner, and then my mother laid out 6 pictures, photographs of Japanese American Nisei girls, whom I knew personally very well. And she said, why don't you marry one of these? I said, gee, I know all of those, but I prefer not. Well, it was a traumatic experience for my mother and father, to the point that she made a flat statement, you are not to invite any family friends. No family friends, nobody related with the Yamanaka family are to be invited to the wedding. Don't invite your brother. And that was it. With that, my brother did not come. I did not invite any ethnic Japanese families other than Wayne Osaki, a very close friend of mine, who acted as an usher to the wedding. And mother and father came to the wedding. But other than that, it was all friends. The director of the International Institute of San Francisco hired me for a position there, and I stayed there for several years until the director said, Mr. Yamanaka, there's no future in the agency here. All the positions are occupied that you could go into, and nobody's going to retire. And so you should leave the agency, find another agency with some future in it. And so she found me a position as a supervisor in Fresno, California. Well, the weather was not to my liking. In the summertime, nor the wintertime. And so I submitted my resignation and came back to San Francisco without a job, at which time Mission Community Center, where I did my field work, was looking for a director after combining with 2 other community centers, and they needed a director for the combined agency. And I applied for that and became director of the new combined Mission neighborhood centers, and stayed there for several years until a position opened at San Francisco State College. I was a director of the Mission Neighborhood Centers when I had already been giving lectures, just lecture here and there within the School of Social Welfare. And finally, one of my colleagues was going on a sabbatical leave, and he asked me whether I would like to take his place. And then we talked about it, and then naturally we talked about salary, and the salary was quite low. I would be paid what would be the differential, what he would be paid for his sabbatical, and what would be left over compared to what I was already making. And the differential was much too wide. And so that was the situation, I think 1 year prior to a position opened, and after Anjali returned from Italy. And so I was offered a position that opened. And that was a regular position on a salary scale, which was closer to what I would expect. So I debated and discussed it with Ruth, my wife, and it still was a differential of about $2,000 below what I was getting at mission neighborhood centers. And we thought in terms of the future, this would be a good investment. And so that's how I joined the faculty at San Francisco State. So then I was a lecturer within the School of Social Welfare. There was some comment that very likely I would never become a full professor without a PhD. It was those years back in 1940s when professors, everybody had a PhD. And my argument was, while my colleagues were working on their PhD, I was working at an agency getting the experience. And I could compare with my colleagues who had a full professorship, where they started and where I started, and my experiences. And they felt that my experience was just practice, not theoretical. So there be it. So that was the name of the game. And I didn't question it because that's what I got into the game of professorship. So I started teaching, and I stayed at a lecturer for 10 years, and then I became an assistant professor, and then for 5 years, assistant. And then I rose one rank to associate professor, and they said, "Morgan, that's about the top you're going to make it." I said, "Well, that's what I expected, and we shall see." I was volunteering to teach in the School of Ethnic Studies around the concentration camp experience of the ethnic Japanese. So I created a course called Concentration Camp USA. And I asked for quarter time off from my social work department and be picked up by quarter time by the School of Ethnic Studies. So I wouldn't lose any salary. And I had an appointment by the School of Ethnic Studies and continue my appointment with the School of Social Work. I was teaching these candidates for their PhD in an agency setting. In those days, in order to become a full-fledged professor, one had to have a doctorate. I only had a master's. And I thought of going back to do doctoral work, but financially I couldn't afford it with the family and all. So I stayed there, and then in time, my work with the School of Social Welfare was such that they offered me a full professorship from an assistant professor. And in that capacity, I stayed there for 44 years and retired in 2006. My family's position had always been, you must get your education. So in my family, I was the only one that attained this almost an unwritten rule that everybody must go to college. And well, I was the only one that really went to college. One of the regrets I have is my mother passed away 1 year before I attained my professorship. That was too bad, because her comment about my switching from sociology to social work was using the Japanese vernacular of social work versus sociology. Sociology is shakai gaku. It's a very esteemed profession in Japan, with philosophy and up there. Whereas shakai gaku is pretty low. And so my mom's comment was, "You're going to leave sociology and work with those niggers in Fillmore District?" The nigger being the vernacular in Japanese for black people at that time. And so that was how she saw my profession of change from sociology to social work. When I started teaching, the students were, if I may use the word, malleable. They were quite malleable the way we taught them. And very few questioned our motivation until the student organization became active, at which point the students would start asking. And that was the start of another thinking process. It was a different thinking and another thinking process on part of students to question the instructor. I would allow questioning, and they would raise question on a certain sphere. But now with student movement, the sphere of questioning became much broader. And so that was more fun for me to be answering questions from like that. Fortunately, my community work, as well as my ethnic background and working in Japanese community in Japantown, and working for the welfare of the Japanese community in terms of the white business taking over, gave me some idea what was involved in a different perspective. So I was able to present another perspective or help teach students to look at it from another perspective. And I said, some of these questions, there are no answer. There are no even literature. Because that was the early game. So that was fun in those days to be teaching. During the troubled times on campus, one of the things that I could describe to you was the faculty at first were helpless, felt completely helpless. The faculty did their own strike and they just marched out there without getting involved in a strike itself. Until a few of us, about 10 of us, faculty members said, "We got to do something here. The students are getting bashed up." And so I was one of those 10 people, 10 males. There was another about 10, 15 female faculty member. And the 10 males said, "Okay, tomorrow we'll go between the police and the students, so the students would not get beat up by the cops." And so that was where I volunteered, where the other faculty went to discuss this situation with Hayakawa. Not much success there. In my case, I think I made some dent. On that morning, I put on a full suit, and then I put thick sponge so that I could absorb any baton being hit on my shoulder or the back. And then I wore a hat that day, and inside the hat I also wore a very heavy sponge, so in case I get hit in the head. So with that, I got in between the student and the police, and my job essentially was calming the students down, not the police. At the end of the day, I was wondering how to get to my office. All the paths were blocked by the police. And so I'm walking toward my office in the site building. And as I'm walking, the police opened the path between them, invited me to walk right through them. And as I walked through, they said, "Thank you, Professor." That made my day. And so I made some impact there. Hayakawa's part, he got his position as a senator of the United States. The Republican Party nominated him for senator, which he got, and which he slept through most of the time. Or he was a great one for sleeping, both at the faculty and at the Senate. So he made no impact one way or the other. If anything, a negative impact to the point that he was not re-elected. In terms of the student movement, I think there was a great impact. If it hadn't been for the student movement, there would have been no ethnic studies. There would have been no ethnic studies, the Native American studies, the Latino studies, the black studies like this. It was all a result of the strike that created not only School of Ethnic Studies, but underneath various units of the ethnic studies that came about because of wise selection of faculty, chosen by the faculty, not upstairs down, but downstairs up. And Jim Hirabayashi was one of the dean that was first, and he was very positive in this role. And so I think we made a big impact. My role in doing the student strike was I was holding back the student strikers. I knew who the leaders were. And I said, "Look, you can't go up there. You can't go up there. No leader can afford to get arrested because we need you for tonight's planning of tomorrow." And so that they could understand. And I was able to help students understand strike was more than just yelling at the top of the head that students do that. You got to do planning. To me, the student strike movement was just part of teaching. I feel that the activities I participated in the student strike was no different than the classroom activities, getting students more involved in what they were studying. So I felt the student strike did not take one precedence over another. Oh, my children now, one is Los Angeles, the oldest is about 50, and my youngest is in Petaluma, and she takes care of all my books, pays all my bills, takes care of all my insurance matters, takes care of everything. And then my other daughter lives in Mill Valley, and she just drops in with the two kids, and as soon as they come in, they're still young enough, 4 and 5, they strip bare naked and run into the hot tub. They're at that age, they're still wonderful. My oldest son, Tiki, graduated UC Santa Cruz and got his law degree at Santa Clara. Beverly went to California State College in San Diego. And she sent me a letter once said, "Dad, I cannot get any classes down here. I don't have any class that I need. So do you think you could help me get at least one class?" I said, "Well, I don't know. Why don't you come up here?" Well, she was taking Italian down there. She had tried Japanese, it was too difficult. And her Italian class had 64 students. And she enrolled at San Francisco State Italian class, 16. She said, "Dad, there's only 16 in my class. I thought half of the class just didn't show up." But that was it. And she was just shocked that the degree of education was so different. So she was quite happy that she had come up here. And then my other daughter, oldest daughter, had started at San Francisco State. And she was, God help me, I have no idea why she became an accounting major. Math? Me? Anyway, she became an accounting major, and she found a position as an accountant in one of the downtown firms, where she started working. And then the boss said, "Why don't you go to a school for stock broker?" And so he helped her go to stock brokerage school. Well, that was her first step beyond accounting. And then after a while, she said, "I think you're ready to go to stock trading class now." So she's a stock trader now. Anyway, interesting background. And you know, you put it all in perspective.